What if the person you were destined to love was the one you destroyed with your own hands? Imagine being the strongest alpha in 3 territories, feared, respected, untouchable. You had the perfect Luna, soft-spoken, fiercely loyal, eyes that looked at you like you hung the moon. And then, you believed the whispers. You let pride poison your heart. You stood under a full moon and said the words no mate should ever hear. I reject you. You watched her walk away bleeding from a wound no one else could see. You told yourself she was weak. You told yourself you did it for the pack. You told yourself she'd come crawling back. She didn't. Months later, you stand at the Lunar summit, and you see her. She's radiant. She's calm. Her hand rests on a round, glowing belly. And the scent of the child inside her? It belongs to another alpha, not yours. What could have you do if it was you? Tell us in the comments section. Chapter 1, Shattered Bonds and Silent Echoes. The moon hung low over the Whispering Pines Pack territory, a silver sentinel casting long shadows across the ancient forest. Ronan, the alpha of the pack, stood in the heart of the clearing, his broad shoulders tense under the weight of his fur-lined cloak. His dark hair fell in unruly waves over his forehead, and his piercing blue eyes, usually so commanding, now burned with a mix of fury and regret. He had built this pack from the ashes of betrayal, forging alliances with iron will and unyielding strength. But tonight that strength felt like a curse. Mira stood before him, her slender frame trembling not from the chill of the night air, but from the storm raging in her chest. Her golden hair cascaded down her back like a waterfall of sunlight, and her emerald eyes that had once gazed at him with unwavering adoration, now shimmered with unshed tears. She was his Luna, his fated mate, the one the moon goddess had chosen to stand by his side, or so they had believed. For months, whispers had poisoned the air, accusations that Mira was weak, unfit to bear the air the pack so desperately needed. Ronan had listened to them, let them fester until doubt became conviction. "You've betrayed me," Ronan growled, his voice low and guttural, echoing the wolf within him. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, claws threatening to extend. "The elders say you've been seen with outsiders, plotting against the pack. And now, this infertility? It's a sign, Mira, you're not strong enough for this life." Her heart shattered at his words, each syllable a dagger twisting deeper. "Ronan, please," she whispered, her voice breaking like fragile glass. She stepped closer, her hand reaching out to touch his arm, feeling the heat of his skin through his shirt, heat that had once set her soul ablaze. "Those are lies. I've given everything to you, to this pack, my love, my loyalty. It's all been for you. We can try again." The moon goddess. "Enough!" He jerked away from her touch as if it burned him, his eyes flashing with golden wolfish light. The rejection hit her like a physical blow, sending waves of agony through their mate bond. It was a sacred connection, one that bound their souls. But Ronan was severing it deliberately, his alpha command ripping through her like thorns. "I reject you, Mira, as my Luna and my mate. Leave this territory before dawn or face the consequences." The world tilted. Mira gasped, clutching her chest as the bond snapped, a searing pain that radiated from her heart to every nerve. It was worse than death. A living wound that bled invisibly. Tears streamed down her cheeks, hot and unrelenting, but she lifted her chin, drawing on the quiet strength she'd always hidden beneath her gentle exterior. "You'll regret this, Ronan," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside. "One day you'll see what you've thrown away." He turned his back on her, the ultimate dismissal, his broad frame silhouetted against the moon. "Go," he commanded, his tone laced with finality. But as she walked away, her footsteps crunching softly on the fallen leaves, a part of him, a buried, aching part, wanted to chase after her, to pull her into his arms and beg forgiveness. He crushed it down, convincing himself it was for the pack's future. Months blurred into a haze of emptiness for Ronan. He took a new consort, a fierce she-wolf named Vesper, whose sharp beauty and ambition matched his own. She warmed his bed, her touches calculated and passionate, but they left him hollow. Nights were filled with restless dreams of Mira's soft laughter, her body arching beneath him in the throes of their once unbreakable passion. He remembered the way she'd whisper his name like a prayer, her fingers tracing the scars on his chest as they lost themselves in each other under the stars. Those memories haunted him, a bittersweet torment that made every victory in pack wars feel meaningless. The pack thrived under his rule, expanding territories and forging new alliances. But Ronan's heart remained a barren wasteland. He threw himself into hunts, his wolf form tearing through the woods with savage grace. But even the thrill of the chase couldn't drown out the echo of her absence. Whispers reached him occasionally. Mira had vanished into the wilds, perhaps joining a rogue pack or fading into human society. He told himself he didn't care. Until the night of the Lunar Summit, alphas from across the regions gathered under the full moon at the neutral grounds of Silver Peak, a majestic mountain enclave where treaties were signed and rivalries simmered. Ronan arrived with his entourage, his presence commanding respect as always. Vesper clung to his arm, her red lips curved in a possessive smile, but his mind wandered. The air buzzed with energy. The scent of pine and wolf musk thick in the breeze. That's when he saw her. Mira emerged from the shadows of the tree line, her arm linked with Silas, the enigmatic alpha of the Shadow Ridge pack. Silas was a force of nature, tall and lean, with silver-streaked black hair and eyes like stormy seas. His reputation as a strategic genius preceded him, but tonight, it was the way he looked at Mira that sent a jolt through Ronan's veins, protective, tender, intimate. She had changed. Her body, once lithe and delicate, now glowed with a radiant fullness. A soft swell curved her abdomen, unmistakable even under the flowing silver gown that hugged her curves. Pregnant. The word hit Ronan like a thunderclap, his wolf howling in denial within him. She moved with a graceful confidence, her hand resting protectively over her belly as Silas leaned down to murmur something in her ear, eliciting a soft, genuine smile from her lips, a smile Ronan hadn't seen in what felt like lifetimes. Jealousy surged through him, hot and venomous, mingling with a profound sadness that clawed at his soul. How could she be carrying another man's child? His heir? No, Silas's heir. The thought was a knife to the gut, twisting with every breath. He watched as Silas's hand splayed possessively over her lower back, guiding her through the crowd. Their connection was palpable, a quiet intensity that spoke of shared secrets and stolen nights. Ronan's mind flashed back to their own stolen moments. The first time he'd claimed her as his under the harvest moon, their bodies entwining in a frenzy of need and love. Her skin had been like silk against his, her moans a symphony that drove him wild. He'd buried himself in her, marking her with bites that healed into symbols of eternal bond. Now, those marks were gone, erased by his rejection, and Silas had taken his place. He approached them, unable to stop himself, his steps heavy with unspoken fury. "Mira," he said, his voice rough, barely containing the tremor. She turned, her emerald eyes meeting his without flinching. There was no hatred there, only a distant sorrow, like looking at a faded photograph. "Ronan," she replied softly, her hand instinctively cradling her belly. Silas stiffened beside her, his gaze sharpening into a warning. "You're with child," Ronan managed, the words tasting like ash. His eyes dropped to her swell, imagining the life within, a life that should have been his. "Yes," she said, a small painful smile touching her lips. "Silas and we found something real, something that doesn't break." Silas's arm tightened around her, his voice a low rumble. "She's my Luna now, Ronan, and this child is the future of Shadow Ridge." The words were a punch to the soul. Ronan felt the world narrow to that moment, the joy in her eyes, the protectiveness in Silas's stance, the undeniable truth that she had moved on while he remained chained to his regrets. Pain lanced through him, sharp and unrelenting, but beneath it flickered a reluctant happiness for her. She deserved this peace, this love that didn't demand her to be anything but herself. As the summit began, Ronan watched from afar as Silas pulled Mira into a secluded alcove during a break. He shouldn't have followed, but his wolf drove him, silent paws carrying him close enough to witness. Silas pressed her gently against the rough bark of a tree, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was both tender and fierce. Mira's hands roamed his back, pulling him closer, her body arching into his touch. Silas's fingers traced the curve of her breast through the fabric, eliciting a soft gasp from her, a sound Ronan knew all too well. "Silas," she murmured, her voice husky with desire. "Not here. The others, they can wait," he growled, his mouth trailing down her neck, nipping at the sensitive skin where her pulse thrummed. His hand slipped lower, cupping her swell reverently before dipping between her thighs, teasing through the layers of her gown. Mira's head fell back, a moan escaping as she surrendered to him, her fingers tangling in his hair. Ronan turned away, his chest heaving, the scene burning into his mind. It was steamy, intimate, a display of passion that mirrored what he had lost. Sadness washed over him in waves, painful and raw, but seeing her happy, truly happy, brought a bittersweet smile to his lips in the darkness. She had risen from the ashes he had left her in, yet as he walked back to the gathering, a fire ignited within him. He couldn't let her go, not without fighting for what was once his. But how, when she carried another alpha's heir? Chapter 2, Whispers of Regret. Ronan remained rooted at the edge of the summit clearing long after Mira and Silas disappeared back into the crowd. The night air felt colder now, sharper against his skin, as though the moon itself had turned its face away from him. He could still taste the ghost of her scent on the wind, jasmine and warm rain, and something new, something sweet and milky that belonged to the child growing inside her. Another man's child. Silas's child. His wolf clawed at the inside of his ribs, snarling, demanding he stalk after them, rip Silas's throat out, drag Mira back to the den that still carried the faint trace of her in the furs. But the man in him, the broken, hollow man, knew better. He had no right anymore. He turned blindly and walked deeper into the shadowed paths that wound between the ancient cedars, away from the bonfires and laughter and politics. His boots crushed pine needles into the earth with every furious step. He didn't stop until he reached a small frozen waterfall that spilled silver threads over black rock. There he sank to one knee, pressed his forehead against the icy stone, and let the first real sob tear out of him since the night he'd rejected her. It was ugly. Animal. A sound no alpha should ever make. He saw her again in the dark behind his eyelids. Not the glowing, pregnant Luna standing beside Silas tonight, but the Mira he'd once held every night. The memory came without mercy. Late summer. The pack asleep. Only crickets and the distant howl of sentries. Mira had slipped into his chambers barefoot, wearing nothing but one of his old linen shirts. The hem barely brushed her thighs. She'd crawled onto the bed without a word, straddling his hips while he was still half dreaming. "Ronan," she'd whispered against his mouth, voice thick with sleep and want. "I need you." He'd flipped her beneath him in one motion, swallowing her surprised laugh with a kiss that tasted like blackberries and moonlight. His hands had roamed under the shirt, finding soft skin, hardened nipples, the slick heat between her thighs already waiting for him. She'd arched so beautifully when he pushed 2 fingers inside her, curling them just the way she loved, watching her eyes flutter shut and her lips part on a trembling moan. "You're mine," he'd growled against her throat, nipping the place he'd marked her months earlier. "Always," she'd gasped, nails raking down his back hard enough to draw blood. "Always yours." He'd taken her slowly that night, agonizingly slowly, until she was begging, until tears of pleasure slipped from the corners of her eyes, until she shattered around him so hard her thighs shook for long minutes afterward. Then he'd held her through the aftershocks, kissing every inch of her damp skin, murmuring how perfect she was, how he would burn the world down before he ever let her go. Now that memory felt like swallowing glass. Ronan's fist slammed into the rock beside his head. Once, twice, skin split, blood dripped dark onto the frozen ground. He didn't feel the pain. He only felt the absence. When he finally staggered back to the guest lodges, Vesper was waiting. She lounged across his bed like a panther in heat. Black silk robe parted just enough to reveal the long golden line of her thigh, the swell of her breast. Her crimson lips curved when she saw the blood on his knuckles. "Rough night, my alpha?" she purred, sliding off the bed and sauntering toward him. Ronan said nothing. She reached for him anyway, fingers trailing down his chest, nails catching on the fabric. "Let me make it better." He caught her wrist before she could slip lower. "Don't," he rasped. Vesper's eyes narrowed, but the smile never left her mouth. "Still thinking about her?" He didn't answer. She laughed softly, cruel, knowing. "She's gone, Ronan, swollen with another male's pup, and you're here, bleeding for a ghost." Something snapped. He shoved her back against the wall, not gently. Her breath hitched, not in fear but excitement. Vesper liked it rough. Always had. His mouth crashed onto hers, more punishment than passion. She moaned into it, legs parting instantly as he hiked her thigh around his hip, his hand shoved between them, finding her already wet, already ready. He didn't bother with gentleness. 2 fingers plunged inside her hard and fast, curling until she cried out against his shoulder. "Yes, fuck harder!" He gave her what she wanted. He fucked her against the wall with brutal, punishing strokes, her nails carving bloody trails down his back, her teeth sinking into his neck. She came fast and loud, shuddering around him, screaming his name like a victory chant. He followed moments later, spilling inside her with a guttural groan that felt more like defeat than release. When it was over, he pulled out and stepped away. Vesper slid down the wall, legs trembling, chest heaving. She looked up at him with glittering eyes. "You didn't even look at me," she said quietly. Ronan turned his back, bracing both hands on the table. "Get out." She laughed once, short, bitter, then gathered her robe and left without another word. He stood alone in the dark, breathing hard, hating the smell of sex and shame that clung to his skin. Sleep refused to come. Instead, he dreamed. He dreamed of Mira in a moonlit meadow, naked except for moonlight on her skin. Her belly was round and full, glowing softly. She smiled at him, not the distant, polite smile from earlier tonight, but the old smile, the one that used to unravel him completely. He dropped to his knees before her. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice cracking. "I was wrong. I was so fucking wrong." She reached down, fingers threading gently through his hair. "I know," she said softly, "but I'm happy now." He pressed his forehead to the gentle swell of her stomach, feeling the faint flutter of life beneath. Not his life, not his future. Still, he kissed the taut skin there, reverent, aching. "I love you," he breathed against her. "I'll always love you." Mira's hand tightened in his hair, almost painfully. "Then let me go, Ronan," she whispered. He woke with a gasp, chest heaving, cock painfully hard against his stomach, tears already drying on his temples. The room was empty. The fire had died to embers, and somewhere miles away, Mira slept in Silas's arms, safe and loved and carrying the future he would never touch. Across the valley in the Shadow Ridge lodges, Mira stirred. Silas felt it instantly, his arm tightening around her waist, pulling her closer against his chest. "Bad dream?" he murmured, lips brushing the shell of her ear. She shook her head, but her fingers found his and squeezed. "Just memories," she whispered. Silas rolled her gently onto her back, rising above her in the dark. Moonlight painted silver streaks across his shoulders, his chest, the sharp line of his jaw. "Tell me what you need," he said, voice low and rough with sleep and devotion. Mira looked up at him, really looked, and felt the last jagged edge of old pain smooth away. She reached up, cupping his face. "Make me forget everything except right now," she breathed. Silas's eyes darkened with hunger and tenderness in equal measure. He kissed her slowly, achingly slowly, tongue stroking hers like he was memorizing every taste. His hand slid down her body, reverent over the full curve of her breasts, the heavy roundness of her belly, until he reached the soft curls between her thighs. She was already wet for him, always so ready. He groaned against her mouth when his fingers slipped through her folds, circling her clit with feather-light pressure that made her hips jerk. "Silas?" "I've got you," he promised, voice wrecked. "Always got you." He moved down her body, kissing every inch of skin he passed, lingering over the places that made her tremble. When he settled between her thighs, he draped her legs over his broad shoulders and looked up at her with eyes gone pure silver. "Beautiful," he growled. "Every fucking inch of you." Then his mouth was on her. Slow, worshipful, devastating. He licked her like she was the only thing that mattered in the world. Long, dragging strokes, then tight circles around her clit, then sucking gently until she was writhing, fingers knotted in his hair, pleading. When she came, it was quiet, intense, her whole body bowing off the bed as pleasure rolled through her in deep, endless waves. Silas didn't stop until the last tremor faded. Only then did he crawl back up, kissing her through the aftershocks, letting her taste herself on his tongue. He entered her carefully, slowly, watching her face the entire time, checking for any discomfort. There was none. Only need. Only love. They moved together in perfect rhythm, deep and languid, every thrust a vow. His hand cradled her belly protectively even as his hips rolled in slow, grinding circles that made her gasp against his throat. "I love you," he whispered against her lips, "both of you." Mira's arms wound around his neck, tears slipping free. Not from pain, but from the overwhelming sweetness of being wanted so completely. "I love you too," she breathed. "So much." When they came, it was together. Quiet, shattering, perfect. Afterward, Silas tucked her against his chest. One hand splayed over her stomach, feeling the tiny flutters of their child. Mira smiled into the dark, sleepy and safe. And somewhere far away, Ronan lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hollow echo of his own heartbeat, wondering how a man could lose everything and still be breathing. Chapter 3. Shadows of the Past. Ronan did not return to the lodge that night. He stayed by the frozen waterfall until the moon slid low, and the first gray fingers of dawn reached through the pines. The cold had long since seeped into his bones, but he welcomed it. Anything to dull the furnace of regret still burning under his ribs. When he finally walked back through the summit grounds, the world was waking. Servants carried trays of steaming tea. Alphas in fine cloaks greeted one another with careful smiles. Somewhere a lute player tuned strings for the morning ceremonies. Life continued, indifferent, relentless. He felt like a ghost moving among the living. He avoided the main paths. He kept to the quieter trails that skirted the edges of the gathering, hood pulled low until he reached a small overlook carved into the mountainside. From here he could see the Shadow Ridge banners fluttering silver and midnight blue below. He could see the wide tent where Silas and Mira had retired. He told himself he would only look for a moment. He stayed far longer than that. The tent flap opened. Mira stepped out first. She had changed into a simpler dress of deep forest green, the fabric soft and flowing, gathered gently beneath her breasts so it draped lovingly over the roundness of her belly. A thick shawl of cream wool rested across her shoulders. Her golden hair was loosely braided, strands escaping to catch the pale morning light. She looked peaceful. Not fragile, not broken. Peaceful. Silas appeared behind her a heartbeat later. He carried a fur-lined cloak in one hand and a steaming mug in the other. Without a word, he draped the cloak around her shoulders, then pressed the mug into her palms, folding her fingers around it so she would feel the warmth through her gloves. Mira smiled up at him. Small, private, the kind of smile that belonged only to two people who had already shared 1,000 quiet mornings. Silas bent and brushed a kiss against her temple. Not possessive, not performative, just tender. Ronan's throat closed. He remembered mornings like that. Mira used to wake before him sometimes. She would slip out of bed, wrap herself in his cloak because it smelled like him, then return with 2 mugs of tea. She would climb back under the furs, press her cold feet against his calves just to hear him growl in mock complaint, then settle against his chest while they watched the sky lighten through the window. She used to trace idle patterns on his forearm and murmur, "Tell me something true today." And he would, small truths, foolish truths, dangerous truths, because with her the words never felt heavy. Now she stood in another male's cloak, holding another male's tea, listening to another male murmur something low and private against her hair, and she smiled the same way. Ronan turned away so sharply he nearly lost his footing on the frost-slick stone. He walked without direction until he found himself at the edge of the neutral grounds, where the forest grew thick and wild. He leaned against the rough bark of an ancient cedar and closed his eyes. The memory came again, softer this time, almost gentle in its cruelty. It was the night after their mating ceremony. The pack had feasted and danced until the stars began to pale. When the last guest finally left, Mira had taken his hand and led him down to the river bank where moonlight turned the water to molten silver. She'd kicked off her shoes and waded in, laughing when the cold made her gasp. Then she'd turned, held out both hands, and said, "Come swim with me, Alpha. I want to feel your heart against mine under the stars." He'd stripped without hesitation and followed her into the current. They hadn't made love that night, not in the frantic, claiming way everyone expected. Instead, they had floated together, her legs wrapped loosely around his waist, arms around his neck, foreheads pressed together while the river carried them in slow circles. She'd whispered against his lips, "I'm not afraid of forever with you." He'd answered, "I'll make sure forever feels like safety." He had meant it. He had truly meant it. Now the river still flowed somewhere in the distance, but the girl who once trusted him with forever was gone. Ronan opened his eyes and looked down at his hands. They were shaking. He thought of Vesper's cruel laughter the night before. He thought of the way he'd used her body like a weapon against his own guilt. He thought of how empty it had left him. And for the first time since the rejection, something cracked open inside him. Not anger, not jealousy, but something quieter and far more dangerous. Grief. Pure adult, bone-deep grief. He slid down the trunk of the tree until he sat on the cold ground, knees drawn up, forearms resting across them. He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes until colors burst behind the darkness. He didn't cry again. He had no tears left for theatrics. He simply sat there and let himself feel the full weight of what he had destroyed. Across the valley, Mira walked slowly beside Silas along one of the quieter paths. She had been quiet since they left the tent. Silas never pushed when she went silent like this. He simply stayed close, present, steady, a warm shadow at her side. After a long stretch, she finally spoke. "I saw him last night," she said softly. "Not close, just across the firelight. For a second our eyes met." Silas's stride didn't falter, but his hand found hers and laced their fingers together. "Did it hurt?" he asked. Mira considered the question carefully. "Not the way it used to," she answered. "It was more like pressing on an old bruise. You feel the echo of pain, but the wound itself has healed over." She stopped walking. Silas stopped with her. She turned to face him, free hand resting on the curve of her belly. "I keep waiting to hate him," she said, almost surprised by her own words. "I thought hate would be easier, cleaner. But mostly I just feel sad for him, for the man he could have been if he hadn't chosen pride over love." Silas studied her face for a long moment. Then he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a slow kiss to her knuckles. "You have the biggest heart I've ever known," he said quietly. "Even after everything, you still find room for sorrow instead of venom. That's not weakness, Mira. That's strength most people will never understand." Her eyes shimmered. She stepped closer until her forehead rested against his chest. "I don't want to carry bitterness into our daughter's life," she whispered. "I want her to grow up knowing love doesn't have to hurt." Silas wrapped both arms around her, careful, protective, one palm cradling the back of her head. "Then that's what she'll know," he murmured into her hair. "Because you're her mother. And I will spend every day making sure neither of you ever has to question whether you're safe with me." Mira let out a trembling breath that was half laugh, half sob. She tilted her head back so she could look up at him. "I love you," she said, simple and sure. "I love the way you see me, all of me, even the parts that still ache." Silas's gaze softened until it felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. "I love every part," he answered. "The parts that hurt, the parts that heal, the parts that smile at me like I hung the moon. All of it." He leaned down and kissed her, slow, lingering, full of quiet promises. When they parted, Mira rested her cheek against his heartbeat and smiled into the soft wool of his tunic. It was a small smile, but it was real. And somewhere on the far side of the mountain, Ronan rose from the cold earth, brushed pine needles from his cloak, and started the long walk back to his people. He didn't know what came next. He didn't know if forgiveness was even possible, whether for her to give or for him to receive. But for the first time in months, he felt the tiniest flicker of something besides rage or despair, something that felt dangerously close to hope. And it terrified him, because hope meant possibility. And possibility meant he might still have to face the wreckage he'd made. Chapter 4. Fractured Alliances. Ronan did not speak to anyone for the rest of that morning. He moved through the summit like smoke, present but untouchable, nodding when protocol demanded it, offering clipped words when an alpha or elder approached, then slipping away before conversation could deepen. His wolf paced restlessly beneath his skin, claws scraping at the edges of control, but he kept the beast leashed. Barely. By midday, the council fires were lit again. Neutral ground rules required all alphas to attend at least one joint session before the summit closed. Ronan took his place on the raised stone bench reserved for the Whispering Pines delegation. Vesper sat beside him, posture perfect, smile sharp. She smelled faintly of last night's bitterness and the perfume she always wore to mask it. He didn't look at her. Across the wide circle of firelight sat Silas, and beside Silas, Mira. She had changed into a heavier cloak against the rising wind, deep indigo wool trimmed in silver fox. Her hands rested lightly over her belly, in an unconscious protective curve. Every so often she would shift, and Silas's gaze would flick to her immediately, checking, reassuring, ready. It was the smallest gesture, and yet it sliced Ronan deeper than any blade ever had. The session began with border disputes. Voices rose, then fell. Accusations were traded like currency. Ronan spoke twice, once to defend a contested river crossing, once to counter a claim on hunting grounds. His tone was cold steel, precise, unyielding. No one would have guessed that inside his chest something was quietly tearing itself apart. Then the topic shifted to alliances. An elder from the northern pack stood and proposed a formal pact between Whispering Pines and Shattering. The eastern rogues grow bolder, the old wolf said, voice gravelly. They do not respect bloodlines or borders. A united front would serve us all. Murmurs rippled through the gathering. Silas inclined his head in acknowledgement. Shattering is open to discussion, he said evenly, but any pact must be built on mutual respect, not obligation. Eyes turned to Ronan. He felt every gaze like a weight. Vesper's hand brushed his thigh beneath the fold of his cloak, a silent reminder of where his future was supposed to lie. He ignored it. He looked straight across the fire at Silas. Then slowly, deliberately, his gaze slid to Mira. She did not flinch, she did not look away. For one long, aching heartbeat, their eyes locked. In that suspended moment, Ronan saw everything he had tried to bury. The girl who once laughed until she couldn't breathe when he tried to teach her pack hunting calls. The woman who held his face between her hands after his first real battle and whispered, "You came back to me." The mate who used to fall asleep with her cheek pressed to his heartbeat, trusting that it would still be beating for her in the morning. And he saw the woman she had become, quieter, stronger, carrying life that was not his, standing beside a male who had never once made her question her worth. The pain was exquisite. Not the hot flash of jealousy, not the dull ache of regret. This was something sharper, cleaner, almost reverent. It was the pain of finally seeing clearly. He tore his gaze away before anyone could read the fracture in his expression. "I will consider the proposal," he said, voice low and rough. "Whispering Pines does not enter alliances lightly." The elder nodded, satisfied for now. The session dragged on. When it finally ended, the alphas rose. Groups formed. Conversations splintered into smaller fires. Ronan stood, intending to leave immediately. But Mira moved first. She rose carefully, accepting Silas's steadying hand. Then, without hesitation, she walked straight toward Ronan. The entire clearing seemed to still. Vesper stiffened at his side. Silas's eyes narrowed, tracking every step Mira took. Several wolves from both packs subtly shifted their weight, ready to intervene if needed. Mira stopped 3 paces away, close enough that Ronan could smell her. Jasmine, warm skin, the faint sweetness of impending motherhood. She looked up at him, not with anger, not with pleading, with something far more devastating, calm honesty. "Ronan," she said quietly. Her voice carried only to him and the handful of people nearest. "I'm not here to fight, or to forgive, or to ask for anything." He couldn't speak, his throat had locked. She continued anyway. "I just needed you to see me, one time, without the anger or the rumors or the version of me you built in your head to justify what you did." She laid one hand lightly over her belly. "This is my life now, my daughter's life, and it is good. It is safe. It is loved." Each word landed like a soft hammer against stone. "I don't hate you," she said. "I did for a while. But hate is heavy and I refuse to carry it anymore. I hope someday you find a way to set down whatever weight you're still holding." She paused. Then almost gently, "You were my first everything. That doesn't vanish, but it doesn't own me anymore either." Ronan felt the exact moment something inside him gave way, not with a crash, but with the quiet snap of a branch too long under snow. He wanted to reach for her. He wanted to drop to his knees and beg. He wanted to tell her he understood now, too late, that she had always been the stronger one. Instead, he only managed one hoarse word. "Mira." Her eyes softened, just a fraction. "Be kind to yourself, Ronan," she said. "Not for me, for you." Then she turned and walked back to Silas. Silas met her halfway, slid an arm around her shoulders, and guided her toward their people without once looking back at Ronan. The clearing slowly exhaled. Vesper's fingers dug into Ronan's forearm. He shook her off without looking at her. He walked away, past the fires, past the lodges, past the boundary markers, until he reached the same overlook from earlier that morning. This time he did not sit. He stood at the edge, staring down at the valley where Shadow Ridge banners still flew, where Mira was already surrounded by wolves who would die for her and her child without a second thought. Wind tore at his cloak. His eyes burned. But he did not cry. Instead, he felt the first real, fragile thread of something new weave itself through the ruin inside him. Pride. Not pride in himself, he had none left. Pride in her. In the way she had walked up to him in front of every alpha in the region and spoken truth without trembling. In the way she protected her peace with the same ferocity other wolves used to protect borders. In the way she had chosen joy over vengeance. He hated that he had no part in that joy. And yet, some small bruised part of him was grateful it existed at all. That she existed at all. That she had survived him. Ronan closed his eyes and let the wind scour him clean. Somewhere below, Mira leaned her head against Silas's shoulder as they watched the afternoon light turn the valley gold. She felt the baby kick, strong, insistent, alive. A tiny foot pressed against her palm. She smiled, small and luminous. Silas felt the shift in her breathing and looked down. "Everything all right?" he murmured. Mira nodded. "Everything is going to be all right," she whispered. And for the first time in a very long time, she believed it with her whole heart. Above them, on the ridge, Ronan opened his eyes again. The horizon stretched wide and merciless. He took one slow breath, then another, and began the long walk back down the mountain. Chapter 5, Echoes of Desire. Ronan reached the bottom of the mountain trail just as the afternoon sun began to slant golden through the trees. The summit grounds were alive with movement. Delegates packing horses, servants rolling banners, laughter and farewells drifting on the wind. He moved among them like a shadow, unseen, untouched, until he reached the Whispering Pines encampment. He did not enter his own tent. Instead, he walked past it, past Vesper's sharp glance, past the curious eyes of his own warriors, and kept going until he found the small, seldom-used meditation grove tucked behind the eastern ridge. A single flat stone sat in the center, worn smooth by generations of wolves who had come here to think, to grieve, to decide. He lowered himself onto it now. For a long time, he simply breathed. In, out, in, out. Each breath carried the same question he had been avoiding since Mira walked away from him at the council fire. What now? The answer refused to come neatly packaged. There was no clean path forward, no heroic gesture that could erase what he had done. Only fragments, sharp, mismatched pieces of a life he had broken with his own hands. He thought about fate. He thought about choice. He thought about how the moon goddess was supposed to weave perfect matches, unbreakable bonds, and how he had taken scissors to the thread anyway. A twig snapped behind him. Ronan didn't turn. He already knew the scent. "You're bleeding," came the low, familiar voice of Elias, his second-in-command and oldest friend. Ronan glanced down. His knuckles, still raw from the waterfall 2 nights earlier, had split open again sometime during the walk down the mountain. Fresh blood smeared across the stone. He shrugged. Elias stepped into view and crouched in front of him, forearms resting on his thighs. His dark eyes searched Ronan's face with the kind of quiet patience that only came from years of witnessing every version of the man in front of him. Brave, furious, grieving, lost. "You look like death warmed over," Elias said plainly. Ronan gave a short, humorless laugh. "Feels accurate." Elias didn't smile back. Instead, he asked the question no one else had dared to ask since the rejection. "Do you still love her?" The words landed like a thrown gauntlet. Ronan's jaw tightened. He stared at the blood on his hands for so long that Elias began to think he wouldn't answer. Then very quietly, "I never stopped." The confession felt like tearing open a wound that had only just begun to scab. Elias exhaled through his nose. "Then why the hell did you throw her away?" Ronan lifted his gaze at last. His eyes were bloodshot, exhausted, but clear in a way they hadn't been in months. "Because I believed I was protecting the pack." He paused, tasting the bitterness of the lie he had told himself for so long. "Because I believed strength looked like control. because I was terrified that if I let myself be vulnerable, even with her, someone would use it against me. Against us. He looked away again, toward the valley where Shatterridge wolves were already moving out in orderly columns. And because I was arrogant enough to think I knew better than the moon goddess. Elias stayed silent for several heartbeats. Then he said, "You were wrong." "I know." "No," Elias pressed. "You were catastrophically wrong, and she paid the highest price for it." Ronan flinched. "But," Elias continued softer now, "she's not paying anymore. Look at her, Ronan. Really look. She's not limping, she's not hiding. She's walking tall with a child in her belly, and a male who would tear the world apart before he let anyone hurt her again. That didn't happen despite what you did. That happened after what you did. She rebuilt herself while you were still busy punishing yourself." Ronan's throat worked. "I don't know how to live with that," he admitted. "You don't have to like it," Elias said. "You just have to accept it, and then decide what kind of man you want to be on the other side of that truth." Ronan closed his eyes. The wind moved through the grove, stirring leaves, carrying distant voices. Somewhere down the valley, Mira laughed. Bright, unguarded, the sound floating up like birdsong. Ronan's chest ached with a strange, bittersweet heat. Not jealousy this time. Something closer to awe. She had survived the worst thing he could have done to her. She had not merely survived, she had thrived. And that realization burned brighter and more painfully than any memory of their past intimacy ever could. Down in the valley, Mira sat on a fallen log beside the trail while the Shatterridge caravan made final preparations to depart. Silas crouched in front of her, checking the straps on her riding cloak with careful fingers. "You're quiet," he observed. She tilted her head, studying the way sunlight caught in his silver-streaked hair. "I spoke to Ronan today," she said. Silas's hand stilled for half a second before resuming their work. "I saw." Mira reached out and touched his wrist, stopping him. "I told him I don't hate him," she said, "and I meant it. But I also told him that what we have, this life, this future, is mine now, and I won't apologize for loving it." Silas looked up at her, then really looked. His gaze was steady, searching, full of a quiet pride that made her heart squeeze. "You don't have to explain yourself to anyone," he said, "least of all to me. I know." She smiled, small and sure. "I just needed to say it out loud, to someone who would understand why it mattered." Silas rose, pulling her gently to her feet with him. He cupped her face in both hands, thumbs brushing the apples of her cheeks. "It matters because you're choosing joy," he murmured. "Every single day, even when it would be easier to stay wounded. That kind of courage is rare, Mira, and I am never going to stop being in awe of it." Her eyes shimmered. She leaned forward until their foreheads touched. "I used to think love had to be loud," she whispered. "Big gestures, grand declarations. But this," she pressed her palm to his chest, feeling the steady beat beneath. "This quiet certainty you give me every day. It's the loudest thing I've ever known." Silas exhaled a shaky breath. Then he kissed her. Not fiercely, not desperately, but with the slow, deliberate reverence of someone who understood exactly how precious this moment was. When they parted, Mira rested her head against his shoulder and watched the last of the summit fires being doused in the distance. A tiny foot kicked against her palm. She smiled into Silas's tunic. "She agrees," she murmured. Silas chuckled low in his throat. "Of course she does, she's your daughter." High above them, Ronan finally stood from the meditation stone. He looked down at the valley one last time, watched the Shadow Ridge column begin to move, watched Mira settle carefully onto her horse with Silas's steadying hand at her back, watched the way she turned her face toward the sun like she was drinking it in. He felt the ache again, deep, familiar, almost comforting now in its honesty. But beneath it something else flickered. Not hope, not yet, but possibility. The possibility that a man could lose everything he thought mattered most, and still learn how to become someone worthy of mattering to someone again. He turned away from the valley, took the first step back toward his own people, and for the first time in months the weight on his shoulders felt just a fraction lighter. Not gone, never gone, but lighter, and that he decided was enough to keep walking. Chapter 6, Tides of Jealousy. Ronan did not ride out with the main Whispering Pines column that afternoon. He lingered at the summit grounds long after most delegations had departed, giving orders to Elias in short, clipped sentences. Secure the eastern trail, Double the scouts along the river border. Make sure the supply wagons reach the stronghold before nightfall. Routine, necessary, safe topics. Anything to keep his mind from circling back to the single image that had branded itself behind his eyes. Mira's small, luminous smile as she leaned against Silas's shoulder, the way her hand had rested so naturally on the swell of her belly while she watched the sun turn the valley gold. He told himself he was staying behind to oversee the final dismantling of their camp. He was lying. He stayed because he wasn't ready to leave the last place where he had seen her breathing the same air. By late afternoon, the grounds were nearly empty. Only a few stragglers remained. Servants rolling canvas, a pair of young betas arguing over who had to carry the last crate of ceremonial silver. Ronan stood at the edge of what had been the council circle, staring at the blackened ring of stones where the central fire had burned. Footsteps approached from behind. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. Vesper stopped a few paces away. She had changed into riding leathers the color of fresh blood. Her dark hair was pulled into a severe braid that made her look even sharper, more dangerous. "You're stalling," she said. Ronan didn't answer. She stepped closer. Close enough that he could smell the sharp spice of her perfume layered over the faint musk of frustration. "You think if you wait long enough she'll come back?" Vesper's voice was low, mocking, but there was a tremor beneath it. "She won't. She's gone. She's carrying his air. She looked at you today like you were already a memory." Ronan's shoulders tensed. Vesper laughed once, short, brittle. "You hate that, don't you? That she doesn't need you anymore, that she doesn't even hate you enough to keep you in her thoughts. You're nothing to her now. Just a lesson she already learned." The words landed like sparks on dry grass. Ronan turned slowly. His eyes were very dark, very still. "Be careful, Vesper." She lifted her chin, defiant. "Or what? You'll reject me too? Cast me out the way you cast her out?" She took another step, voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You think I don't see how you look at her? How you still look at her? Like she's the only thing that ever mattered? Like I'm just convenient?" Ronan's jaw flexed. "You were never convenient," he said quietly. "You were a choice. And what a terrible one it was." The air between them crackled, sharp, electric, full of all the things they had never quite said aloud. Vesper's eyes glittered with something dangerous, hurt masquerading as fury. "I could have been enough," she said, almost too soft to hear, "if you had let me." Ronan looked at her, really looked, and saw the fracture he had ignored for months. The pride she wore like armor, the hunger for something permanent that she disguised as ambition, the quiet fear that she would always be second to a ghost. Guilt twisted low in his gut, but it was not the same guilt he felt for Mira. This was smaller, sharper, more immediate. "I'm sorry," he said. Vesper blinked. He had never said those words to her before. She searched his face for mockery and found none. For one suspended moment, something raw flickered across her features. Hope, maybe, or grief, or both. Then she shuddered it. "Don't be sorry," she said coldly. "Be finished. Either finish with her in your head or finish with me in your bed, but stop trying to keep both." She turned on her heel and walked away, spine rigid, braid swinging like a whip. Ronan watched her go. He did not call her back. Instead, he closed his eyes and let the silence rush in. And in that silence came the tide he had been trying to outrun all day. Jealousy. Not the hot, explosive kind he had felt at the summit when he first saw Mira's pregnancy. This was slower, deeper, colder. It was the jealousy of watching someone else give Mira the safety he had promised and then stolen from her. The jealousy of knowing Silas woke up every morning to her sleepy smile, to her hand reaching for him across the furs, to the quiet wonder of feeling their child move beneath her skin. The jealousy of understanding, too late, that Mira had never asked him for power or perfection. She had only ever asked for faithfulness. And he had failed her at the one thing that mattered most. The ache spread through his chest like frost. He opened his eyes and looked toward the horizon where the Shadow Ridge column had disappeared hours earlier. Somewhere along that trail Mira was riding beside Silas. Somewhere along that trail she was laughing, or resting her head against his shoulder, or speaking softly to the daughter growing inside her, and she was doing it all without him. The realization should have crushed him. Instead, it did something worse. It made him want fiercely, painfully, to become a man who could be proud of the happiness she had found, even if he had no place in it. He wanted to hate Silas for taking what had once been his, but more than that, he wanted Mira to never again know the kind of fear he had put in her eyes the night he rejected her, and that want burned brighter than any jealousy ever could. Miles ahead, the Shadow Ridge caravan had stopped for a brief rest beside a wide, shallow stream. Mira sat on a flat rock with her boots off, feet in the cold water, skirt tucked up around her calves. Silas crouched beside her, filling their water skins. She watched the way his shoulders moved beneath his tunic, the careful way he kept one eye on her even while his hands were busy. A small, private smile curved her lips. He noticed. "What?" he asked, glancing over. "Nothing." She tilted her head. "Just gets grateful." Silas set the waterskin aside and came to sit beside her. He didn't ask for explanation. He never needed to. Mira leaned against him, shoulder to shoulder. "I used to think jealousy was the worst thing a heart could feel," she said quietly. "But today I realized something worse." Silas waited. "Indifference," she finished. "If Ronan had looked at me with indifference today, that would have hurt more than anger ever could." Silas reached over and laced his fingers through hers. "He didn't look at you with indifference." "No," she agreed softly. "He looked at me like he was drowning and I was the last shore he'd ever see." Silas's thumb brushed slow circles across her knuckles. "And how did that make you feel?" Mira exhaled. "Sad," she said, "but also free." She turned her face toward him. "Because I realized I don't have to carry his pain anymore. I can be sad for him without letting it live inside me." Silas lifted her hand and pressed his lips to the inside of her wrist. "You are the strongest person I've ever known," he murmured against her skin. Mira smiled, small, real, a little shaky. "And you are the safest place I've ever found." They sat like that for several long minutes, feet in the stream, hands clasped, the baby kicking gently between them like a quiet third heartbeat. Above them a hawk circled once, twice, then flew west into the deepening gold of late afternoon. And somewhere far behind, Ronan finally swung into the saddle of his waiting horse. He did not look back. He nudged the stallion forward and began the long ride home. Chapter 7, Healing Scars. Ronan reached the Whispering Pine stronghold 3 days after the summit ended. The gates opened for him in silence. No triumphant horns, no cheering warriors lining the walls. Only the steady creak of iron and the muted thud of hooves on packed earth. The pack felt the shift in him before he even dismounted. Wolves lowered their eyes longer than usual. Voices softened when they greeted him. Glances lingered with unspoken questions they didn't dare voice. He handed his reins to a stable boy without a word and walked straight through the great hall, past the long tables still scarred from last winter's feasts, past the roaring hearth that had once warmed Mira's laughter, up the wide stone stairs to the Alpha's private quarters. He closed the heavy oak door behind him. For a long moment he stood motionless in the center of the room. Everything was exactly as he had left it. The furs on the bed still carried the faint imprint where he used to lie beside her. The carved wooden box on the mantel still held the braided cord she had once tied around his wrist during their mating ceremony. The window still framed the same view of the pine-covered ridge where they used to run together at dawn. He crossed to the box, opened it with careful fingers, and lifted the cord. The fibers were worn soft from months of wear. He remembered the night she tied it, her tongue between her teeth in concentration, her eyes shining with shy joy, the way she had whispered, "Now you carry a piece of me even when I'm not beside you." He had worn it proudly until the day he cut it off with a dagger and threw it into the fire, telling himself it was weakness to keep reminders of a mate he had already decided was unworthy. Now the cord felt heavier than any crown. Ronan closed his fist around it and pressed it to his chest. Something cracked open inside him, not with violence but with the slow, inevitable give of ice under spring sun. He sank to the floor beside the bed, back against the frame, knees drawn up, and for the first time since the rejection he allowed himself to remember without immediately drowning the memory in rage or liquor or distraction. He remembered the small things, the way she hummed tuneless songs while brushing her hair, the way she always left the last bite of honey cake for him, because she knew he loved it more than he admitted, the way she would press her cold hands to his ribs in the middle of the night just to hear him grumble, then giggle when he pulled her closer anyway. He remembered the bigger things too. The night she stood between him and a rival alpha twice her size, chin high, voice steady. "You will not touch him while I still breathe." The morning she woke him with tears in her eyes because she had dreamed their first child would have his eyes and her smile. The quiet afternoons when she sat beside him while he worked through border maps, her head on his shoulder offering no advice, just presence. Presence he had mistaken for silence. Silence he had punished. The cord bit into his palm. He didn't cry. He simply sat there and let the memories wash over him like rain on parched earth. Some sweet, some bitter, all of them true. Downstairs, the pack moved around him like water around stone. They felt the shift in their alpha's scent, still sharp with grief, but no longer edged with self-loathing. Something had changed, not healed, not yet, but softened. Elias found him hours later. The second leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, studying the man on the floor with the braided cord still clenched in his fist. "You're not drinking," Elias observed. "No, you're not breaking things." Ronan gave a faint, tired smile. "Not tonight." Elias stepped inside and lowered himself to sit against the opposite wall. They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Elias spoke. "I saw her face when she spoke to you at the summit. She wasn't afraid of you anymore." Ronan nodded once. "That's what hurts most," he said quietly. "Not that she loves someone else. Not even that she's carrying his child. It's that she no longer needs me to be strong for her. She found that strength somewhere else. Somewhere I told her she didn't have it." Elias exhaled slowly. "And now?" Ronan looked at the cord in his hand. "Now I learn how to live in a world where she is happy without me. Where her happiness doesn't depend on my apology, or my regret, or my redemption. Where I don't get to be the hero of her story anymore." He lifted his gaze to Elias. "And maybe I learn how to be proud of that instead of destroyed by it." Elias studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, decisive. "That's a start." Far to the north, in the sheltered valley of Shatteridge, Mira stood on the wide balcony of the Alpha's residence. The night was crisp, stars sharp against velvet dark. A soft wind carried the scent of cedar and snow from the higher peaks. Silas stepped out behind her, draping a thick fur across her shoulders before wrapping his arms around her from behind. His chin rested gently on the top of her head. She leaned back into him, hands covering his where they cradled her belly. "She's been quiet tonight," Mira murmured. Silas pressed a kiss to her temple. "Maybe she's listening to us." Mira smiled into the dark. "I keep thinking about something I said to Ronan," she confessed softly. "That I don't want to carry bitterness into her life. But sometimes I wonder if forgiving him so easily makes me weak." Silas's arms tightened just enough to remind her she was held. "Forgiving him isn't about him," he said. "It's about refusing to let what he did define the rest of your days. It's about choosing that your daughter will grow up in a home where hearts can break and still learn how to love again." Mira turned in his arms so she could see his face. "You make forgiveness sound like courage," she whispered. "Because it is." She searched his eyes, steady, certain, full of the same quiet fire that had drawn her to him when she was most broken. "I'm not sorry I left him," she said. "I know. I'm not sorry I found you." Silas's expression softened until it felt like sunlight breaking across his features. "I'm not sorry you let me love you," he answered. Mira rose on her toes and brushed her lips against his. Not a claim, not a demand, just a simple, aching thank you. When she settled back, she rested her forehead against his chest. "I think she just kicked," she whispered. Silas's hand slid down to cover the spot. They stood like that for a long time, 2 heartbeats and one tiny third one fluttering between them, while the wind sang through the pines and the stars watched in silence. And somewhere far to the south, in a room lit only by dying embers, Ronan finally rose from the floor. He walked to the window and looked out at the same night sky. He opened his hand. The braided cord lay across his palm like a fragile promise he had once broken. Very slowly, he tied it around his wrist again, not as a claim, not as a shackle, but as a reminder. A reminder that love had lived here once, that it had been real, that he had been capable of giving it, even if only for a season. He tied the final knot with steady fingers. Then he looked up at the moon, full, bright, indifferent, and spoke the first honest prayer he had offered in months. "Let her be happy," he whispered. "Let her daughter be safe. Let her never know fear again because of me." The wind answered with a soft rush through the open window. Ronan closed his eyes. And for the first time since the night he broke her heart, the ache in his chest felt less like punishment, and more like mourning something beautiful that had once been his to protect. Chapter 8. Flames of Redemption. Ronan did not sleep that first night back in the stronghold. He sat at the heavy oak table in the Alpha's study, the braided cord still knotted around his wrist, a single candle burning low between his hands. Maps and reports lay untouched in front of him. Instead, he stared at the flame until his vision blurred, letting the small, stubborn light remind him of something he had almost forgotten. Even the tiniest spark could survive long enough to become something greater. At dawn he rose, dressed in plain leathers instead of the ceremonial cloak he usually wore, and walked down to the lower training yard. The warriors already there fell silent when they saw him. He did not address them with commands or speeches. He simply picked up a practice blade, stepped into the sparring circle, and waited. One by one, the younger fighters stepped forward, hesitant at first, then bolder. They came at him hard, fueled by weeks of uncertainty about their Alpha's state of mind. Ronan met every strike, every feint, every reckless charge. He did not dominate them. He did not humiliate them. He simply moved, steady, precise, present, taking blows when he could have evaded, letting them land hits that would bruise tomorrow. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, sweat soaked his shirt and blood trickled from a split lip. The yard was full now, pack members watching from the walls and balconies. He lowered his blade, breathing hard. Then he spoke, voice rough, carrying without needing to shout. "I failed you," he said. "Not in battle, not in territory. I failed you in the one place a leader should never fail. I let fear and pride make me cruel to the person who trusted me most." Silence pressed thick around the words. "I cannot undo what I did to Mira. I cannot give back the months I stole from her heart. But I can make sure no one under my protection ever feels that kind of betrayal again. Not from an enemy, not from their own Alpha." He looked around the faces, some angry, some confused, some quietly nodding. "So from today forward, any wolf who raises a hand against their mate, their child, or anyone who has sworn loyalty to this pack will answer to me. Personally. No excuses, no rank, no mercy." He let the promise hang in the air, heavy and final. Then he turned and walked out of the circle. No one cheered. No one argued. But the silence that followed him felt different, charged, watchful, almost reverent. Word spread quickly. That afternoon, a young Omega named Lyra came to the gatehouse trembling, her cheek bruised purple. Her mate already locked in the holding cells by the sentries who had heard the new decree. Ronan went down himself. He listened to her halting story, saw the fear in her eyes, and felt the old shame rise like bile in his throat. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply knelt so he was level with her gaze and said very quietly, "You are safe here, you will always be safe here, and I am sorry it took me so long to make that true." Lyra's tears fell then, silent, exhausted tears of someone who had stopped expecting kindness. Ronan stood, gave the order for the mate to be stripped of rank and exiled beyond the border, and walked Lyra to the healer's quarters himself. He stayed until she was settled, until she looked at him with something other than fear. Small acts, quiet ones, but each one felt like kindling laid carefully around the ember he was trying to keep alive. Far to the north, winter was beginning to tighten its grip on Shadowridge. Mira stood in the wide stone kitchen of the main lodge, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hands deep in a bowl of bread dough. The room smelled of yeast and wood smoke and rosemary from the stew simmering on the hearth. A handful of younger pack members worked around her, chatting, laughing, stealing bits of dough when they thought she wasn't looking. She felt the baby shift, lower now, heavier, and pressed a flour-dusted hand to her side with a soft smile. Silas appeared in the doorway, snow still clinging to the shoulders of his cloak. He had been out checking the northern passes with the scouts. The moment he saw her, the tension in his face eased. He crossed the room without a word, brushed snow from his gloves, and came to stand behind her. His arm slid around her waist, hands settling protectively over the swell of her belly. "You're supposed to be resting," he murmured against her ear. "I'm supposed to be living," she corrected gently. "And this feels like living." He pressed his lips to the side of her neck, just a brief, warm touch, then rested his chin on her shoulder, watching her hands knead the dough with steady rhythm. You're glowing, he said softly. She laughed under her breath. I'm sweaty and covered in flour. You're glowing, he repeated, more certain this time, and she feels it too. The baby rolled in agreement, pressing a tiny heel against Silas's palm. Mira leaned back into him, letting his warmth surround her. I heard something today, she said after a moment. One of the traders who came through the pass mentioned Whispering Pines, said their alpha has changed the laws on mate bond abuse, made it punishable by exile. No exceptions. Silas went still. Mira kept working the dough, but her voice was quieter now. I don't know if it's true. I don't know if it's because of me or because of something else, but if it is true... She paused, searching for the right words. It feels like a kind of redemption I never asked for, and I don't know what to do with that. Silas turned her gently so she faced him. His eyes were steady, thoughtful. You don't have to do anything with it, he said. His choices are his to carry. You already carried enough. Mira looked down at her hands, flower-streaked, strong, trembling just slightly. I spent so long being angry, she whispered, then so long being sad, and now I mostly just feel tired of carrying any of it. I want to be here, with you, with her, with this life we're building. I don't want to spend any more of it looking backward. Silas lifted her chin with careful fingers. Then don't, he said simply. Look at me. Look at the fire. Look at the snow falling outside the window. Look at the daughter who already knows your heartbeat better than anyone else's. That's where your eyes belong now. Tears welled, hot and sudden. She didn't fight them. She let them fall while Silas brushed them away with his thumbs, never once looking away. I love you, she said, voice thick. I love this, all of it, even the parts that still ache when I remember. I love you too, he answered, aches and all. He pulled her close, careful of her belly, careful of the dough still on her hands, and held her while the kitchen kept moving around them. Young wolves pretended not to notice, but they did. They saw their Luna crying quiet, healing tears in the arms of their alpha. They saw safety. They saw love that didn't demand perfection, and something settled in the room, soft and certain. Later that night, after the lodge had quieted, Ronan stood alone on the highest tower of the Whispering Pines stronghold. Snow had begun to fall, fine, stinging flakes that caught in his lashes. He looked north toward the distant peaks he could not see. He did not pray this time. He did not ask for forgiveness. Instead, he spoke into the wind, low and rough, as though the words were meant for no ears but his own. I'm trying, he said. I don't know if you'll ever know. I don't know if it matters. But I'm trying to be the man you once believed I could be. Not for you. Not to win anything back. Just because the world deserves fewer broken hearts, and because you deserved better than the one I gave you. The wind took the words and carried them north. Ronan stayed there until the cold drove deep into his bones. Then he turned and went inside. Not lighter than before, not healed, but burning, quietly, stubbornly, with the first real flames of something that might one day be called redemption. Chapter 9, Bonds Unbroken. Ronan woke before first light. The tower room was still dark, the only sound the low moan of wind moving through the narrow arrow-slit windows. He had not dreamed, not of Mira, not of blood, not of anything at all. For once his sleep had been empty, and somehow that emptiness felt like mercy. He rose, dressed in the same plain leathers from the day before, and walked the silent corridors of the stronghold. The pack still slept. Only the night sentries nodded to him as he passed, their eyes carrying a new kind of respect, not awe of strength, but recognition of something quieter. He ended up in the old archive hall. Dust motes drifted in the thin gray light that slipped through high windows. Shelves stretched to the ceiling, filled with scrolls, bound ledgers, and crumbling tomes that recorded every birth, every death, every alliance and betrayal since the pack first claimed this valley. He pulled down the oldest volume he could reach, the one bound in cracked black leather stamped with the crescent moon sigil of the first alpha. The pages smelled of cedar and thyme. He did not search for any particular entry. He simply opened the book at random and began to read. Names, dates, causes of death, brief notes in faded ink. Lost a rogue attack, left 3 young. Died in childbed, babe survived. Banished for striking his mate, never returned. Page after page, the same quiet truths repeated. Love had been broken here before. Trust had been shattered. Hearts had bled. And still the pack endured. Ronan traced one line with his finger. She forgave him before she died. Said hate was too heavy to carry into the next life. His throat tightened. He closed the book slowly and returned it to the shelf. Then he sat on the cold stone floor back against the shelves and let the weight of all those lives settle around him. He thought about Mira, not with longing this time, not with jealousy, but with something gentler, something almost like gratitude. She had not let his failure be the final word of her story. She had written new sentences. She had chosen light over shadow. She had carried her pain long enough to understand its shape, then set it down so her daughter would never have to pick it up. That act of courage felt larger than any battle he had ever won. Ronan pressed his palms flat against the stone and whispered into the stillness. "Thank you." Not loud enough for anyone to hear, just loud enough for the words to exist. "Thank you for surviving me. Thank you for showing me what strength really looks like. Thank you for not letting my worst moment become your whole life." He stayed there until the first real sunlight turned the dust golden. Then he stood, brushed the dust from his leathers, and walked out into the new day. Far to the north, snow had fallen thick during the night. Shadowridge woke under a soft white blanket that muffled every sound. Mira stood at the window of their sleeping chamber, wrapped in a heavy fur, watching fat flakes drift past the glass. The baby had dropped lower still. Every step felt deliberate now, every breath a small negotiation with gravity. Yet she felt strangely light inside. Silas came up behind her barefoot, hair still sleep-rumpled. He didn't speak at first, just rested his hands on her shoulders and looked out at the same quiet world. After a long moment, Mira said, "I dreamed about the day I left Whispering Pines." Silas's fingers tightened slightly, not in tension, but in readiness to hold whatever came next. She continued softly, "I dreamed I was walking through the forest alone. No pack, no destination, just snow under my feet and silence everywhere. And I was crying, not loud, just steady, like my body needed to empty itself of everything I'd been holding." She turned her head so she could see his profile. "But in the dream I kept walking, and the crying didn't feel like weakness, it felt like making room." Silas exhaled slowly. "Making room for what?" "For this." She covered his hands with hers, pressing them over the place where their daughter rested. "For quiet mornings, for bread dough on my fingers, for the way you look at me like I'm still the most astonishing thing you've ever seen. For her." Silas turned her gently to face him. His eyes were very dark, very bright. "You made that room yourself," he said. "I just had the honor of stepping into it." Mira smiled, small, tremulous, radiant. "I used to think forgiveness was something you gave to the person who hurt you. But last night I realized it's something you give to yourself. Permission to stop punishing your own heart for trusting the wrong person." She reached up and touched his cheek. "I forgive myself for loving him once, for believing the promises, for thinking I could be enough to change someone who wasn't ready to change." Silas leaned into her palm. "And now?" he asked quietly. "Now I love you without any part of me still waiting for the other shoe to drop, without any part of me still braced for betrayal. I love you. Freely." The word hung between them like a bell note, clear, resonant, final. Silas closed his eyes for a second, as though the weight of her words had physically touched him. When he opened them again, they were wet. "I've never been anyone's safe place before," he said, voice rough. "Not like this, not all the way down to the roots." Mira stepped closer until there was no space left between them. "You are mine," she whispered, "and I am yours, and nothing that came before changes that truth." He lowered his forehead to hers. They stood like that while the snow kept falling, silent, steady, covering the world in something clean and new. Later that morning, they walked together through the snow-dusted courtyard. Mira moved slowly, one hand in Silas's, the other cradling her belly. Young wolves ran past, laughing, pelting each other with snowballs. One of them, a girl no older than 12, stopped abruptly when she saw Mira. She hesitated, then stepped forward and held out a tiny snowball she'd been shaping. "For the baby," she said shyly. "So she knows snow is fun." Mira accepted it with grave ceremony, then pressed the cold little ball to her belly. "She says thank you," Mira told the girl. "She's already planning to throw much bigger ones when she's your age." The girl beamed and ran off, shouting to her friends that the Luna's baby was going to be fierce. Silas watched the exchange with a quiet smile. "You're already teaching her how to be kind," he murmured. "I'm teaching her how to be herself," Mira corrected gently. "Kindness is just one of the shapes that can take." They walked on. Above them the sky cleared slowly, sunlight breaking through in long, pale shafts. And far to the south, in the Whispering Pines stronghold, Ronan stood on the same high tower as the night before. The snow here was thinner, already melting under a stronger sun. He looked north again. This time he did not speak aloud. He simply let the feeling rise and sit in his chest without trying to fight it or name it. A complicated, aching, beautiful thing. Sadness for what was lost forever. Pride for what she had become. Quiet joy that the world still contained someone capable of loving so completely after being broken so thoroughly. He rested his forearms on the stone parapet and breathed in the cold, clean air. Somewhere deep inside him, a knot that had been there for months finally loosened. Not gone, but no longer strangling. He felt the braided cord against his wrist. He smiled, small, private, a little sad, a little hopeful. Then he turned and went down. Chapter 10, Eternal Heirs. Ronan remained on the tower until the sun climbed high enough that the snow on the distant peaks began to glisten like scattered diamonds. He did not linger out of sentiment. He lingered because the view north felt different today, like a door that had finally been allowed to close without being slammed. He turned away from the parapet at last, descended the winding stairs, and stepped into the great hall. The pack was already gathering for the midday meal. Long tables groaned under platters of roasted venison, dark bread, honeyed roots. Children darted between legs, laughing. Elders sat near the hearth, trading stories older than the stones beneath their feet. The ordinary music of a living pack filled the space. Ronan did not take the high seat. He walked instead to a quieter table near the back wall, where the younger warriors and several Omegas usually sat. Heads turned as he approached. Conversation faltered. He pulled out a bench and sat among them. No announcement. No explanation. He simply reached for a piece of bread, tore it, and began to eat. A stunned silence stretched for perhaps 10 heartbeats. Then one of the younger betas, a boy named Torin who had barely been old enough to shift when Mira left, found his voice. "Alpha, you're sitting here." Ronan met the boy's wide eyes. "I am," he said simply. Torin swallowed. Then, very quietly, "We heard about the new laws, about Lyra, about what you said in the training yard." Ronan nodded once. Another wolf, a quiet she-wolf named Mara, who had once served as one of Mira's personal attendants, leaned forward. "Is it true you tied her cord back on your wrist?" Every head at the table turned. Ronan lifted his hand, let the braided cord catch the firelight. "It is." Mara's eyes shimmered, but her voice stayed steady. "She would be proud of that," she said. "Not because it brings her back, but because it means you finally understood what she was trying to teach you all along." Ronan looked down at the cord. His voice came out rough but calm. "She taught me that love isn't possession. It isn't power. It's choosing someone's safety over your own comfort, every single day, even when they're no longer yours to choose for." A ripple of soft murmurs moved around the table. No one spoke for a long time after that. They simply ate together. Alpha and pack, no hierarchy in that small pocket of the hall. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was a beginning. Far to the north, in Shatterridge, the snow had stopped falling. A pale sun broke through the clouds and turned the valley into a wide, glittering bowl of white. Mira sat in the deep window seat of the birthing room, furs piled around her, a cup of chamomile tea cradled between her palms. The midwives moved quietly in the background, preparing linens, herbs, warm water. Everything was ready. She had felt the first true contraction just after dawn. Slow, deep, patient. Now they came steadily, each one a rolling wave that asked her body to open, to trust, to let go. Silas knelt in front of her, both hands wrapped around hers. His eyes never left her face. Between contractions, he spoke to her in low, steady tones, words that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with love. "You're doing beautifully. I'm right here." "She's almost ready to meet us." Mira smiled through the next crest, sweat beading on her brow. "I know," she whispered. "I can feel her." Another contraction built. She breathed through it, long, slow, deliberate, while Silas pressed his forehead to hers and breathed with her. When it eased, she looked into his eyes and said something she had never said aloud before. "I'm not afraid." Silas's throat worked. "I know," he answered, "and I'm so proud of you I can hardly breathe." The next hours passed in a timeless blur. Pain, yes, sharp, consuming, ancient. But also wonder, also power, also the quiet, unshakable certainty that her body knew exactly what to do. And Silas never once looked away. He held her hands. He wiped her face. He whispered her name like a prayer when the pain peaked. Finally, after one last, long, shuddering effort, the room filled with a new sound. A thin, fierce, furious cry. Their daughter arrived into the world slippery and perfect, arms flailing, lungs already strong enough to announce herself to the mountains. The midwife lifted the tiny red-faced bundle and placed her immediately on Mira's chest. Skin to skin, heartbeat to heartbeat. Mira looked down at the small, wrinkled face and felt something inside her rearrange forever. "Hello, little one," she whispered, tears slipping free. "I've been waiting for you." Silas leaned in, one trembling hand cupping the back of the baby's head, the other resting over Mira's heart. His voice cracked when he spoke. "She has your nose." Mira laughed, soft, exhausted, incandescent. "And your stubborn chin." The baby blinked up at them with wide, stormy gray eyes that would one day carry flecks of silver. But in that first moment, what everyone in the room noticed, midwives, guards at the door, even the wolves gathered outside, was something else. A faint, unmistakable mark on the baby's left temple, a pale crescent moon crossed by a single streak of gold. A hybrid sigil, a symbol no pack had borne in living memory, the mark of two bloodlines joined. The mark of something new. Mira touched it with one careful fingertip. "She's ours," she breathed, "and she's more." Silas pressed his lips to Mira's temple, then to the baby's downy head. "Ours," he echoed, voice thick with awe and quiet fear and overwhelming love. "Whatever comes next, she's ours." Outside, the Shatteridge pack lifted their voices in a long, low howl of welcome. The sound rolled across the valley and climbed the peaks until it reached the cold, clear sky. Far to the south, in whispering pines, the same wind carried the faintest echo of that howl. Ronan stood in the open courtyard, face tilted upward. He did not know what had happened hundreds of miles away. He did not need to. He simply closed his eyes and let the sound move through him. Joy so fierce it almost hurt. Pride so deep it felt like mourning. Peace so fragile it felt like hope. He opened his eyes again, looked north one last time, then turned and walked back inside to his people. The braided cord brushed against his wrist with every step. Small, worn, still tied, still true. And somewhere between the two valleys, beneath the same wide sky, a child with a crescent and gold mark opened her eyes wider and stared at the faces of the two people who would spend the rest of their lives teaching her what unbreakable love could look like. Not perfect, not painless, but eternal. She survived the rejection that was supposed to break her. He's finally learning what he threw away, and their daughter's crescent and gold mark might change everything. If this story wrapped around your heart and refused to let go, hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on post notifications so you never miss an episode. Drop a if Mira's peace healed something in you. Drop a if Ronan's slow redemption is destroying you in the best way. Save this post so you can reread the pain anytime you need to feel something real. Next chapter drops soon. Are you ready for what comes after Eternal Heirs?